Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 14. Hope everybody's doing well. Quick announcement there will be no discussion post this week for Thanksgiving. But I do ask that you guys read the marks because next week's discussion, which will be our last discussion, will touch on the marks that we read this week. So no discussion this week. Happy Thanksgiving. Hope everybody has a great holiday. Okay, so I wanted to talk briefly about the reading from last week, which was Federalist Paper number 10 and Federalist Paper number 51. A little brief background. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the Federalist Papers, but essentially what happens is after the Constitutional Convention, the draft of the Constitution was sent out to the state legislatures to ratify, right? And once the document was sent out, there were several people who actually opposed to the Constitution as it was currently written. They said it gave too much power to the national government. It was taking a lot of power away from the states. And these guys were known as the Anti-Federalists. And you have things like Brutus, was probably Cato was another one. Some of the more popular Anti-Federalists who were writing editorials essentially in opposition to the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton, when he heard about this, decided that he wanted to counteract the arguments that the Anti-Federalists were putting in the papers. So he got James Madison himself and John Jay together to reply to the arguments that the Anti-Federalists were putting together. So they published these series of essays in response to the Anti-Federalists and to explain to the voting members and society at large what the Constitution was actually about and why it was written, and those essays, newspaper articles, essentially they collected them together and they became known as the Federalist Papers, right? So there was never really a book or whatever that was written called the Federalist Papers. It's just a collection of sort of newspaper essays that were submitted by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, written under the pseudonym Publius, which means friend of the people. So just very brief background on the Federalist Papers. So I'm going to spend most of the time during this video talking about Federalist Paper number 10. We will spend some time on Federalist Paper number 51 as well, but for what it's worth from me, I personally believe that Federalist Paper number 10 is the greatest summation defense of American popular government that has ever been written. The greatest defense and explanation of why we have the government that we have. And in a lot of ways, I think it's like a climax, right? It's a climax in this course. All the stuff that we've been reading throughout the semester sort of culminates, and the debates that we've been having all come to a head in Federalist Paper number 10, when Madison sort of cuts to the heart of the matter of popular government and why it could be doomed to fail, and what we can do to actually try to ensure that we can have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people without it devolving into mob rule, which is essentially what Federalist Paper number 10 is all about. And Madison starts off very innocuously talking about factions, but it's really a brilliant argument if you follow it, throughout the entire paper. He starts off talking about factions and popular government, and by the end he's giving this eloquent defense of the Constitution and how the Constitution sets out to cure that ill, right? He says a Republican remedy for a Republican problem, right? A Republican disease. So here we've given this great Republican solution to the problems that arise, this major problem that arises of factions in a popular government. And what are we really talking about when we're talking about factions? Well, he gives a definition that I'll read in a second, but really what we're talking about is something that we've seen mentioned throughout the readings, and that's the tyranny of the majority, right? So, how do you prevent in popular government a majority from rising up and essentially seizing the power that's supposed to be for all the people, right? Protecting the civil rights of all people. How do you prevent the majority from rising up and taking power and just essentially doing everything that benefits them to the negative consequences towards the minority, essentially, is what we're talking about. So, Madison said that factions were the mortal disease, right? The thing that's going to kill popular government. So that's killed popular governments in the past, and the thing that has the most potential to ruin this idea of a government of the people. So according to Madison, a faction is when a number of citizens get together based on a common interest or passion. And it's not just that, right? I mean, that's, if we stopped there, we could say, well, isn't everything a faction, right? I mean, political parties are factions, the NAACP is a faction, the NRA is a faction, et cetera, et cetera. But the second part of that clause, which is really important, is that it's a number of citizens who get together based on their common interest that has a negative consequence for the public good, right? So that's what he's really talking about when he's talking about factions, these groups who get together based on a common passion or interest that is actually contrary to the notion of the public good. And you have to remember that right before the Federalist Papers came out was when Shays' Rebellion took place, right, which was an uprising of farmers who were upset and had this great rebellion and were essentially, it was on the verge of sort of destroying the weak Republican system of government we had at that time under the Articles of Confederation. So Madison had something very concrete and specific in mind when he was talking about factions. But for our instance, we could think about something like maybe, I don't know, the Ku Klux Klan or something like that, right? Maybe a white supremacist group. And, let's say that, for instance, that white supremacist group, if the majority of people in our society held those beliefs, right, then that would obviously call into question notions of the public good when you look at, considering all the minorities and different ethnicities that we have in our country, that the Ku Klux Klan would not obviously operate with their best interest in mind, but rather with promoting their own agenda, right? Maybe you could even look at something like the rise of the Nazi Party, in pre-World War II Germany as another example of a faction coming to power, right? So Madison says, look, this is the problem, right? You're living in a popular government, right, where typically in a popular government things are decided by the majority. The majority votes, and that seems the best way to handle things. But that leads to a problem, because if we're leaving this open to all the people, let's say that all the people have this interest that is in fact negative towards a significant portion of the population. So what can we do, right? How can we actually prevent this? And Madison, he explores two different possibilities. All right, so the first thing he says that we can do to remedy this problem with factions is to try to look at the cause, right? The cause of factions actually coming together. And maybe there's something we can do to actually quell these factions from actually even getting started. But he says there's a fundamental problem with that, right? Because the thing that that we're basing our popular government in our society on for the people is this idea of personal individual liberty, right? He says that liberty is precisely the thing that enables factions, right? Because people have different opinions, people have different capabilities, people have different amounts of wealth, right? So they have all these different stations in their life. And if you give people the liberty to think what they want and say what they want, then people are necessarily going to form different opinions, right? And by forming these different opinions, there are going to be some commonalities, probably maybe geographical, could be religious, could be the sort of economic class that they belong to. People are going to have certain natural affinities that are going to draw them together as a particular group, right? So Madison says in this case that if we try to prevent the cause of factions in regards to liberty, the cure would be worse than the disease, right? So this notion of factions is actually just a sort of a natural and inherent byproduct of liberty. And he later goes on to say that it's a part of human nature, right? The cause of factions are latent in human nature. Let's see. I already talked about the different faculties, right? So people, some people are going to be more inclined to be businessmen. Some people are going to be more inclined to be public servants. Some people are going to be more inclined to be farmers at that time, right? So you have all these different people who have all these different capabilities. If you remember when Aristotle was talking about the different kinds of democracy, he talked about the constitutions of the societies. And he wasn't talking about a legal document. He was talking about the parts of that society that make it up: the farmers, the merchants, the soldiers, etc. So, Madison says this is another thing that leads to sort of the creation of these factions. And once again, he says this is a byproduct of nature. Right? People are born with different capabilities, different interests, and they're just going to necessarily fall into these particular categories. So once again, unless you want to, let's say, socialism, you think about, Lenin or, the Soviet Union, things like that, maybe want to make everybody a farmer or something like that. So maybe that's one way we could try to sort of, eliminate the cause of factions in this particular way, but obviously we're not going to do that. He says that the most common cause of factions and factitious behavior, he calls it, in the history of sort of popular governments is unequal distribution of wealth. Right, that's what's led to the most sort of factitious warfare. And certain sects coming up and certain classes of people coming up and challenging other people. So this inequity in wealth, right? The rich versus the poor, essentially, is what we're talking about. Is another thing that leads to that can topple a government. Right? If the poor become the majority, right, and they form a faction, they can take down, the ruling power and take down that particular form of government. So he says this is a persistent problem, and once again, this is a problem that Aristotle addressed when he was talking about the different forms of government. But Madison says once again, look, if we're going to live in a free society, we're going to have a free economy. This unequal distribution of wealth is just naturally going to occur. And if we're going to have this, free society, this is something that's just going to happen. So we can't really affect the cause in that way. So he finally concludes, if we're going to have a free society, look, the cause can't be removed. We can't do anything about the cause because it's just something that goes along with living in a free society, is this notion of factions arising. So he says if we can't control the cause, then maybe we need to try to mitigate the effects that factions can actually have. And he says, in the first case, if the faction just constitutes a minority, then we're in good shape, right? Because the Republican principle, he calls it, the principle that drives popular government, majority rule, is going to naturally sort of quell the minority faction, so that's not a problem. However, if the faction actually becomes majority, then Houston, we have a problem, right? Because if we're living in a popular government where majority rules and the majority of people belong to this particular class that wants to do things that benefit them and to the exclusion of benefiting the rest of society, then what kind of redress do we have when we're living in a popular society to handle that? And he says that the purpose of the Constitution, the entire purpose of the Constitution, is to provide a way to protect our society against this thing from happening and from the majority faction, sort of seizing power in society to the exclusion of all other citizens. Okay. So he says that there are two possible solutions from how we can handle this, right? And he says the first possible solution is to prevent a faction from ever achieving the majority. All right, so that's one possible solution. The second solution that he talks about is if this faction actually achieves a majority, then we have to have some way of actually preventing this faction from putting its plan into effect. Right, so those are the two possibilities that we have, and then he kind of goes off on sort of a little aside, where he talks about the differences between democracy and a republic. right? And this is where he's making the argument for a republican form of government versus a democracy in the United States and in any free society. Right? He says that if you're living in a pure democracy, you have no redress to the tyranny of the majority. Right? And that's precisely the reason why Aristotle thought that democracy was a perversion of a republic. Right? It's because you're almost inevitably going to fall into the situation where you have the tyranny of the majority. And that's why both Aristotle and Madison preferred a republic. Right? Because in a republic, and he gives a definition of a republic, essentially he calls it some kind of a representative system. Right, so rather than living in a pure democracy, we're living in a system where the people are represented by certain elected officials. Right, so he says right away, this is one way that we can sort of prevent sort of this tyranny of the majority from actually gaining power. Right, is we elect officials who he calls them wiser and more patriotic, which we can certainly, question these days whether it's the case that our elected officials are wiser than the average person or more patriotic than the average person. But that was sort of Madison's theory, is that by electing, these wiser and more patriotic officials, that they're going to be more well equipped to deal with the challenges and see through these factions that actually take place, right? So it's not just the will of the people that decides. You have this sort of wise, benevolent, patriotic figure who can actually see through, what the majority might be saying in this particular case. So that's one advantage that Madison says a republic has over a democracy. So then he goes on another aside, right? So he's kind of sidestepping here, and he says, okay, well, if that's true, and if a republic is more well equipped to deal with the problem of factions, then is a small republic better or is a large republic better? Right? And of course, he's making an argument, in the Federalist Papers for the Constitution, which is essentially giving all the power to the federal government, to the national government. So obviously he's going to prefer a larger republic, right? Because you have all the states themselves currently are the smaller republics, and he's arguing that a much larger republic is much more well suited to deal with this mortal disease, the factions, right? So a large republic that's essentially his argument for why we need to have a strong national government versus just the small states, because the states are not as well equipped to deal with the problem of factions. So he says one thing, if you have a larger republic, right, then the people you're going to have a much bigger body of electors who are actually going to be voting for your particular representative, right? So that means that your representative is going to be much more diversified, right? So not only are they representing the Ku Klux Klan, they're also representing people from the NAACP. So you have this diversity of electors who are actually electing this representative. So on one hand, you have somebody who is sort of beholden to a much more diverse section of the population. On the other hand, by also having more electors, you're ensuring that you're going to get a more qualified official, right? Because, if you have somebody who's elected through 100 people versus somebody who's elected by 100,000 people, the hope is that the person who's elected by 100,000 is actually, potentially going to be more well qualified than the person who's only voted, only received votes from 100 people or so, right? So having this larger republic, there's a larger number of electors, which both diversifies the candidate and should provide you with a more high quality representative. Let's see. But he says this is a problem too, right? And this is a problem that we're well aware of in our society, right? Having this larger, body of, people who are being representative, larger body of electors, actually means that the representative, the person that's supposed to represent you, in the federal government, is not going to be necessarily familiar with who you are, right? And so who exactly are they representing? When you're representing, 750,000 people, how can you possibly adequately represent 750,000 people. And Madison says, look, this is a problem. I recognize this, but there's a solution, right? And Madison's solution is that's the whole reason that we have state legislatures, right? So not only the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, but we also have the Florida House of Representatives and the Florida Senate, right? And the people that are in the Florida House of Representatives and the Florida Senate are supposed to be more representative of their constituents than the people who are actually serving at the national level. And then the last thing that he says, right, about why a larger republic is actually preferable to a smaller republic for dealing with factions is that when you have this sort of representative form of government, democracies, he makes the argument that democracies require sort of a small area, right, to actually to function, because it needs to, you need to have people who, sorry, that beeping was driving me crazy. So democracies needs a smaller area, right? Because you have people who are primarily, dealing with the same sorts of issues, and they can all get together and vote at a particular time. At least back in the day, they didn't have the internet and things like that. But with a republic, when you have representatives, it allows you to expand much more, right? So if you have representatives, you can have a much larger, chunk of government, chunk of land as being governed than you can with a democracy, which is more necessarily more small. So Madison says by instituting this Republican form of government that's based on representation, then it's going to allow the United States to expand significantly. And his hope with that regarding factions was, if you, rather than having the factions concentrated as they may be in a democracy in a small area, if you spread the country out, then those interests are going to have a harder time actually forming a majority coalition to actually, dominate the politics, right? At least that was the theory, and that was, once again, that was back in the day, right? Before the internet and, mass communications, which, has certainly shifted things. But, he was making a geographical argument. The more spread out the states are, the less likely that any one particular coalition is going to be able to form that majority and actually sort of hijack the political process. So those were Madison's arguments for what factions are, why they're a problem, and why the current system of government proposed in the Constitution was the best way to actually address this problem of factions. Okay, real quick, I don't want to say too much about it. I know you guys know a lot about it. Federalist Paper number 51 is essentially talking about the separation of powers and the checks and balances in the American government. Right, because the first problem that Madison lays out is this problem of factions, right? And the second problem is what Federalist Paper number 51 deals with. And Publius in number 51, there's some dispute about whether it was Madison or Hamilton that wrote it. Publius says that there are two great difficulties within a popular government. The first difficulty is to enable the government to rule the governed. Right, and that's essentially what we're talking about in Federalist Paper number 10, talking about the factions. Right, so that's problem number one. Problem number two is enabling government to rule itself. Right, so who watches the watchers? Right, who guards the guardians? Because this is where he's talking about human nature and how human nature has a tendency to be corrupt. And this is where there's so many quotable lines from these two Federalist Papers, but this is where the famous saying, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? And essentially he says that government is the truest reflection of human nature, right? Because, human nature is corrupt in certain ways, therefore we need government to make sure to sort of check ourselves, right, in a lot of ways. But he says not only does this apply to people at large, it also applies to these larger government institutions. In this case, he's talking about primarily the three branches. He's talking about the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch. Right? And like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on this. But, he talks about how the legislative branch is in a popular government. The legislative branch is the branch of the people, right? It's the one that's supposed to represent the people and make the laws. Therefore, in a democracy and in a republican, a democratic republic, the legislative branch is the most powerful branch, right? And he says that. So it's not the case that all the branches are equal. in the way that it was envisioned in the Constitution, the legislative branch was actually the strongest, right? But that's the reason that the legislative branch is actually divided into two bodies, right? Is to try to sort of divide that power up between the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? And he says the idea is to make them as different and independent as possible, right? So there's no collusion that's actually going on in the legislature, right? And then they talk about, talks about the executive branch and, perhaps where the legislative body, is the weakest, that's where the power should be given to the executive branch. And that's what leads some people to think that it was Hamilton, because Hamilton was the one who was most in favor of a strong executive branch. And anyway, the quote that he talks about in the separation of powers and the checks and balances and how the government is set to work is that the separation of powers is designed in such a way that ambition is created ambition is used to counteract ambition, right? So you have each of these bodies sort of in a way kind of working against each other, pressure, counter pressure, right? And each one has a way to sort of, assert their authority in a way to sort of foil the authority of the others, right? And they talk about, it talks also about the judicial branch a little bit and how the judicial branch, he says ideally, all these officials would be elected by the people, right? But the judicial branch is sort of a special branch, and we need special qualifications. And also the fact that the people that serve on the Supreme Court serve for life kind of severs the ties, from the other. So, I mean, the idea was that by the Supreme Court justices being appointed by the president, that actually, creates some sort of connection between the executive branch and the judicial branch. But Madison or Hamilton makes the argument that, because they have to have these special qualifications and that they serve for a life term, it sort of severs that tie between them. So they're not as dependent upon them as the other branches. Right. Anyway, that's enough rambling about Federalist Paper number 1051. We could spend an entire semester talking about the Federalist Papers.